At 7:42 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft return from Pearl Harbor. The task force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, maintaining strict radio silence for the entire 12-day voyage across the North Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers steaming in formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers had accompanied them. The largest carrier strike force ever assembled. The carriers were pitching gently in the Pacific swell. The morning air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal from recovered aircraft engines, and salt spray. Around Genda, pilots and deck crews were celebrating. Men were embracing each other, shouting, laughing with the relief and euphoria that comes after surviving combat. The tension that had gripped the task force for 12 days had broken. They had done it. They had struck the Americans and survived. The attack had been devastating beyond anyone's expectations. 4 American battleships sunk outright. The Arizona had exploded with such force that debris had rained down across Ford Island a quarter-mile away. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, rolling 150 degrees to port, trapping more than 400 men inside her hull. The West Virginia and California had settled to the bottom of the harbor, their superstructures still visible above water, but their hulls shattered by torpedo hits. 4 more battleships were damaged so badly they looked like total losses. The Nevada had tried to get underway during the attack and was beached to prevent her from sinking in the harbor channel. The Pennsylvania sat in dry dock, damaged but repairable. The Maryland and Tennessee were trapped behind capsized ships, their decks torn by bomb hits. 18 ships in total destroyed or crippled. 2,403 Americans dead, hundreds more wounded. Japan had lost only 29 aircraft out of 353 launched. 9 Zero fighters, 5 torpedo bombers, 15 dive bombers. Losses of barely 8%. By any measure of combat, it was an overwhelming victory. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the airstrike, landed on Akagi's deck and reported to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo that the mission was a complete success. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled. The way was clear for Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia. The pilots were jubilant, exhausted, talking over each other about what they had seen and done. But Genda stood apart from the celebration. He was 37 years old, one of the most brilliant aviation tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had spent 11 months since January 1941 working under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to design every aspect of this operation: training schedules, attack formations, target priorities, ordnance loads. The numbers running through his head told a different story than the celebration suggested. A story about mathematics and oil barrels and industrial capacity. A story about logistical calculations that had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. A story that meant Japan had just won a devastating tactical victory while simultaneously guaranteeing its strategic defeat. The problem was not the battleships. Everyone was fixated on the battleships, these massive steel fortresses burning and sinking in the harbor. But Genda knew battleships were becoming obsolete. The future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines, not to slow-moving gun platforms that could be destroyed by aircraft they could never reach. The real problem, the fatal problem, was what the Japanese aircraft had not attacked. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. 49 massive cylindrical tanks stood in 3 separate facilities built over decades as the Navy expanded operations in Hawaii. The lower tank farm, constructed between 1913 and 1923, held approximately 1,400,000 barrels in 22 tanks of varying sizes. The original 5 tanks built in 1913 held 35,000 to 50,000 barrels each. Additional construction in 1923 added 17 more tanks with 50,000 barrel capacity each. The middle tank farm held roughly 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper tank farm, the largest of the 3 facilities, held about 2,500,000 barrels in 17 tanks, each with 150,000 barrel capacity. Together, they constituted the entire fuel supply for the United States Pacific Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later state that Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, and all of it was vulnerable to 50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks were built for peacetime efficiency, not wartime security. They sat above ground, visible from the air, clustered together to minimize piping distances. They were optimized for operations, not survivability. The tanks were clearly visible from the air. Japanese reconnaissance had identified them. Takeo Yoshikawa, operating under the alias Tadashi Morimura from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, had spent months observing Pearl Harbor. He watched ships come and go, counted aircraft at the naval air stations, noted the locations of dry docks and repair facilities. He reported weekly on American fleet movements and base infrastructure through coded messages sent via commercial telegraph. The Japanese attack planners knew about the fuel storage. The tanks were extraordinarily vulnerable. Their walls were made of thin steel, plate designed to hold liquid under atmospheric pressure, not to resist military action. The steel was thick enough to contain fuel oil, nothing more. An armor-piercing bomb, even a smaller 500-pound bomb, would rupture a tank completely. The fuel inside would pour out and ignite. Fuel oil is not as volatile as gasoline. It does not explode spectacularly. But it burns intensely and persistently. A ruptured fuel tank would create a massive fire that would burn for days or even weeks. The heat from one burning tank would be intense enough to rupture adjacent tanks even without direct hits. Fire would spread from tank to tank across the entire farm. Once the first tank was breached and burning, the entire storage complex would be doomed. All 4.5 million barrels would be destroyed. The Pacific Fleet carried approximately 760,000 barrels of fuel in its oilers and ship bunkers combined. That was less than 1/6 of the total stored at Pearl Harbor. In the first 9 days after the attack, the fleet expended approximately 750,000 barrels conducting search operations looking for the Japanese carriers and securing approaches to Hawaii. The fleet had burned through nearly its entire seaborne fuel capacity in just over a week. Without the shore-based storage at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet would have been completely immobilized. If those tanks had been destroyed, the consequences would have been catastrophic for American naval operations. The United States Pacific Fleet would have been forced to abandon Pearl Harbor as a forward base. Every ship would have had to withdraw to the West Coast, to San Diego, San Francisco, or Seattle, more than 2,000 miles away. From California, American ships would have needed twice as much fuel to reach the Western Pacific war zones. A destroyer that could operate for 10 days in the Philippines when based at Pearl Harbor could only operate for 4 days when based in San Diego, because it would burn most of its fuel just traveling to and from the operational area. The operational range of every American warship would have been cut in half. The ability to conduct sustained operations west of Midway would have been crippled. American interference with Japanese conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would have been impossible for at least 12 to 18 months, possibly longer. The United States would have needed years to rebuild storage capacity in Hawaii. 4.5 million barrels of fuel storage cannot be constructed quickly. Each tank required engineering, construction, testing. Support infrastructure had to be built: pumping stations, pipelines, loading facilities, fire suppression systems. The entire logistics chain would have needed reconstruction from scratch, under wartime conditions, while fighting a two-ocean war. But the Japanese aircraft never attacked the oil tanks. Not one bomb was dropped on them. The attack plan did not include the fuel storage facilities as a priority target. Pilots had not been briefed on their importance. No ordnance had been allocated for their destruction. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes focused exclusively on battleships, big, dramatic targets that looked strategically important but were actually rapidly becoming obsolete. The aircraft carriers, the submarines, the repair facilities, the dry docks, and most critically the fuel storage, all of these truly important targets were either absent that morning or deliberately ignored in favor of sinking battleships. This was not an accident. It was the direct result of fundamental miscalculations about the nature of modern naval warfare made months earlier during the planning phase. Miscalculations about fuel consumption, oil production, tanker capacity, and how long Japan could sustain a war without access to American oil imports. Captain Kamito Kuroshima served as senior staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto. Kuroshima was known as one of the most intellectually brilliant officers in the Navy. He had an unusual reputation. He sometimes worked naked in his cabin, claiming that clothes distracted him from strategic thinking. He consumed vast quantities of rice and almost nothing else. He could recite from memory the fuel capacity and cruising range of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical calculation. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer depended entirely on oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum. In peacetime, Japan consumed approximately 32 to 37 million barrels per year for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most of that oil came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo imposed on July 26, 1941, following Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina, had cut off Japan's primary supply source. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed with their own embargoes. Japan was suddenly cut off from more than 80% of its oil imports. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves distributed between Navy stocks, Army stocks, and civilian reserves mandated by 1934 legislation. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations. That translated to approximately 69,600 barrels per day, or 25.4 million barrels per year just for the Navy. Add Army consumption and civilian needs, and Japan was burning through its entire 50 million barrel reserve at an alarming rate. Without new sources of oil, Japan would run out of fuel for military operations sometime in 1943. The nation faced two choices: capitulate to American demands, which would require withdrawing from China and abandoning the entire Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, or go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war. But that choice required answering the fundamental question: could Japan win a war against the United States before running out of fuel? That calculation involved three critical assumptions. Each assumption seemed reasonable. Each was supported by historical precedent, military doctrine, or intelligence analysis. Each proved catastrophically wrong. First assumption: the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans were accustomed to comfort, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, they would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia. This assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability did not matter. Second assumption: Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine that had defined strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima. The combined fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west. There would be 1 or 2 major fleet engagements where Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in climactic surface actions. This meant most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor, consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be actively operating at any time. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, relatively low. Third assumption: capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve Japan's supply problem permanently. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing those fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. The mathematics appeared sound. The strategy seemed viable. In September 1941, with 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the numbers suggested Japan could sustain a war. But every assumption was wrong, and the mathematical errors built into those assumptions would doom Japan before the first shot was fired. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate after 6 months. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor not with defeatism but with furious determination. President Franklin Roosevelt's declaration that December 7th would live in infamy united the country. American industrial capacity shifted to total war, production. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels began building warships. Factories that produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. The entire economy mobilized. The conflict would last 3 years and 8 months, not 6 months. Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. The Pacific War became something entirely different from what Japanese planners anticipated. It involved continuous operations across vast distances. Carrier task forces conducting raids on enemy bases thousands of miles from home. Submarines operating on extended patrols hunting convoys. Amphibious assaults on scattered islands requiring massive escort forces. Destroyers constantly shuttling between bases escorting supply convoys. Every operation required constant movement, constant maneuvering, constant fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. Consider the scale of operations. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots cruising speed consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel oil per day. That same destroyer conducting high-speed operations at 25 to 30 knots consumed 300 to 400 tons per day. Combat operations were never conducted at cruising speed. They were conducted at maximum or near maximum speed. That meant fuel consumption rates 3 to 4 times higher than peacetime planning assumptions. A destroyer on a combat deployment might spend 2 weeks traveling to an operational area, 1 week conducting combat operations, then 2 weeks returning. During the combat week, it would consume as much fuel as it normally consumed in 3 to 4 weeks of peacetime cruising. The planning assumptions that estimated fuel based on average cruising speeds were completely divorced from reality. Multiply this across the fleet. By mid-1942, Japan was operating dozens of destroyers simultaneously on various missions, each one burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption. Add cruisers, which consumed even more. Add carriers and their air groups. Add battleships, massive fuel hogs that burned hundreds of tons per day, even at moderate speeds. Add submarines. Add fleet oilers, which consumed fuel while delivering fuel. The total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. The actual numbers told the story. Japanese military consumption in fiscal 1942, which ran from April 1942 through March 1943, totaled 41.79 million barrels. Planning estimates had assumed 35 to 40 million barrels. The actual consumption was at the high end of estimates during a year when major operations were still ramping up. As the war intensified, consumption would only increase. Fiscal 1943 consumption reached 43.99 million barrels. This was during the height of Japanese operations in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The assumptions that fuel consumption would be manageable and predictable proved completely wrong. Japan was burning oil at rates that exhausted reserves far faster than anticipated. Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged. Allied defenders, knowing they could not hold the territory, had systematically destroyed as much production capacity as possible before retreating or surrendering. At Balikpapan in Borneo,